My name is Ken. My last name is Brown. I got my degree at New Mexico State in 2000. I started working at TRAC in 2001. Have a little broke time here. My degree is in Master's of Science of Experimental Statistics. So not quite in the scenario realm, but I've learned a lot over the last 15 or so years. I am responsible for both scenarios and wargaming development at TRAC-WSMR. So that's where I kind of hang my hat. And for this meeting or for this briefing, I'm going to try to walk you through sort of what scenarios are, why we use them, how they get developed, and then end with a summary. All right, so Rick, if you can give me the next slide, please. All right, so there's our purpose and agenda. You can read, we're going to go through, like I said, the background. I'm going to go through some definitions and some types, characteristics, who uses these, where do they come from, what's the process and those components of the process, and then end up with a summary. Next slide, please, Rick. All right, everybody, so here's the question. Why do we need scenarios? Why are they important at TRAC? You could read the slide. The bottom line here is that the Army is continually preparing to support the defense strategy, the United States defense strategy, in what we call a resource-constrained environment. So we don't have a lot of, our monies are, we have to be very, I would say, frugal with how we spend stuff, and more importantly, what we spend stuff on. Those types of decisions have got to be made concerning, say, force structures, warfighting functions, equipment that we use. We are constantly looking out, 10, 20, 30 years in the future. You can imagine that you just can't buy something off the shelf and get it immediately into production. And then also you can think about it like, I don't want to buy something that's good now because it's a huge investment. What I want to do is I want to buy something that's going to be good in the future when it finally hits production. So, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now. So in order to do this, we have to have an understanding of what that future operational environment, where we're going to find ourselves in 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. So on that second bullet, when I talk about the future operational environment, what is that? Well, I pulled some definitions down, and hopefully this will make some sense. So when I think of an operational environment, that is all of the conditions, the circumstances, the influencers that affect the employment of some sort of capability and how it how it bears on the decisions of the commander. That operational environment is constantly changing. It's volatile. It's uncertain. It's full of events that are ambiguous, and they constantly change. They include, you can think about of all the people in that future operational environment, all the different actors, the friendly actors, the threat actors, the political, sort of how the political landscape of that's going to be, the location, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we do here is we develop scenarios that reflect specific details of that future operational environment. And we conduct analysis based on those scenarios. So the future operational environment, or I would say scenarios, that is the foundation for the types of analysis that we do here. Next slide, please. So what is a scenario? You can read the top. A scenario is a tool that supports the evaluation of Army concepts, capability requirements, and solutions. All right, let me try to put that in a couple different ways. To me, it's a tool that is both a graphic, a narrative, and a data composite that describes those global conditions both during or both prior to and during, and sometimes after a conflict. It's the fight. It's a fight in the future. It provides a common language for analysts to apply when studying that future increasing unfamiliarity and changing conditions. What do they look like? So typically, scenarios are always classified. Sometimes they're classified at the secret level. Sometimes they go to higher levels of classification. It's a document. It's both paper and digital. It could be a few pages. It could be a few hundred pages. It contains all the relevant information about a specific future operational environment. And we'll get to what that information is in later slides. But at the end of the day, you are going to use a scenario, or we are going to use a scenario to support evaluations of U.S. Army concepts, capability requirements, and solutions. Now, below are 3 types of scenarios that we use at TRAC. We use operational scenarios, we use what we call a standard scenario, and then we use study scenarios. So from an operational scenario, when I say an operational scenario, it's typically, you have to think big. It is a campaign or a major operation which is planned and conducted within the larger theater. So it is at the really high strategic level, what they call the theater level of war. The standard scenario, what we call an Army Futures Command standard scenario, that is a more refined operational scenario, and it's specific to a certain region of the globe. And then finally, we have study scenarios. So that's even a more refined scenario product of an AFC standard scenario. And it's usually focused on a specific set of questions that in a specific operational environment that the study or analysts are focused on. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's what a scenario is, but let's talk real quickly about the characteristics of a scenario. So I always think of scenarios as what we call the 5 R's. Are scenarios realistic? Are they reasonable? Are they robust? Are they reusable? And are they responsive? So do they have, like from realistic standpoint, do they have the appropriate forces and tactics on real terrain in expected environmental conditions? Are they derived from a larger scenario or a larger product from the Office of the Secretary of Defense? And I'll get into those products in a few slides. Do they have a realistic projected or programmed future force? So is the threat portrayed realistically in the future, say in 20 years from now? Are the blue forces portrayed 20 years from now? Do we have what we think the right mix of forces are going to be? Because you can't have everything, obviously. Reasonable. Is it a likely road to war? Is the concept of operation during that scenario, is that acceptable? Is it suitable? Is it feasible? Is it robust enough? Do we have a stressful enough situation or combat action to provide that measurement space? And you've heard the term measurement space this morning, to get at the capabilities that the analyst is trying to provide some answers towards. Is it reusable? Can you use it for models and simulations? Is it well documented? And more importantly, can you use it over a variety of studies? Why that is important is because scenario process does take time. And what we don't want to do is have a scenario that's applicable to only one particular study in one particular part of the world, when all of a sudden policy changes and you have to now shift and you may have to build a whole new scenario, which obviously takes time. And then finally, is it responsive? Does it meet the analytical and decision-making needs of the Army and of the Office of the Secretary of Defense? Next slide, please. So this is the who. Who uses scenarios? Below are some of the groups of people that TRAC, the Army, parts of DOD, that use scenarios. Now, these are either, they could use operational scenarios, they could be using standard scenarios, or they could be using study scenarios. And you can see the list. It goes from combat modelers and integrators. So from the briefings that you will see over the next couple days, Combat 21, they use scenarios. Study teams use scenarios. The Future Concept Center uses our scenarios when they have specific studies that they are interested in. The Centers of Excellence across the United States uses our scenarios, and so I would say use scenarios. Vignette is a type of scenario, but they use our scenarios and vignettes in their analysis. Another organization or types of organizations are called CDIDs. They use our scenarios, and then the joint community has used our scenarios in the past, and then the interagency community also uses our scenarios. But the bottom line is that for doing operational analysis about some sort of future concept, some sort of future force structure, future requirements, they all require a common understanding of the operational environment. And so all of those people require an understanding of what the future may look like, that particular fight that is of interest, with the appropriate force structures in order to anchor the types of analysis that they have to do. Next slide, please. Okay, so where do scenarios come from? So this is one of two slides, but so the first thing is, what is the genesis of a scenario? How do they start? So if you look at this slide on the upper left-hand corner, we have, and one of the things we do in scenarios, and as well as TRAC in general, is we have a lot of acronyms. So if some of those acronyms, you don't quite know what they mean, at the bottom of the slide, we have them spelled out. So on the upper left-hand corner, you have that pentagon-shaped graphic that has the Intel community, COCOMs, OSD, various services, and the allies. So out of a community of people come up with, at the Joint Chiefs of Staff level, they determined, hey, what are our scenario priorities? And that is at the top level of the government. They determine what various priorities are going to be. They go through some war games, or what we call TTXs, so those are tabletop exercises. And out of that, you have policy that the Defense Department develops, or that the Office of Secretary of Defense develops. And you develop something called defense planning scenarios. So you have defense planning scenarios, which are typically 8 to 12 pages, and they talk in general about these particular future fights somewhere in the globe. Out of that effort, on sort of that middle, on that second block, you have, at the joint level, they come up with something called Joint Forces Operational Scenarios. So that is a more refined product from 8 to 10 pages, and it is a much more detailed product of how all the joint services are going to fight, for lack of a better word, or what that scenario needs to look like based on the defense planning scenario to the right, which ultimately nests into what the support to the strategic analysis community is interested in. And then coming out of the JFOS, this is where I come into the picture, or we at TRAC come into the picture. So we take a much larger, more abstract scenario product, the JFOS, and we create a Army-specific scenario. So from the previous definitions, the JFOS, you can think of that as an operational scenario. But what we're going to be doing now, where it says TRAC scenario development, now what we're doing at this point is we are developing a standard scenario, or what we call the AFC standard scenario. And then through a process, which I'll get into the next slide, we then produce a Army Futures Command scenario product. Next slide, please. Okay, so we kind of just talked about what a scenario is, the characteristics of a scenario, who uses scenarios. We've talked about sort of the genesis of the scenario, where we start at the SSA level, and then we go down to the joint level, and then we make it into TRAC to make a standard scenario. So this is the scenario development process for a standard scenario. Now, this process is a very deliberate approach. This is how we develop our scenarios, or I should say our standard scenarios. Typically, it's about a 6 to 9 month process. It involves a team of analysts, of military personnel, subject matter experts in particular fields, as well as joint partners. So you could have Air Force, you could have Marine, you could have Navy personnel, you could have people from the intelligence community. I have seen a huge team be put together for this type of for this type of product. So starting in the upper left-hand corner, we always start with guidance. From higher, the Army Futures Command or our TRAC director says, we're going to have to develop a scenario in these various parts of the world. From that, we go through a deliberate process to take a look at what the operational environment is. What is the geographical area? What is the operation type that's required? What force year are we looking at? Are we looking at 2025? Are we looking at 2030? Are we looking at 2035? And then get an understanding of what the measurement space is required. Out of that top block, then we use those source documents. So we're using those defense planning scenarios, or what we sometimes call defense planning guidance. We use theater op boards and operations plans, and we begin to do what we call mission analysis. So we start building scenario products here as well. But of course, those scenario products are informed by the previous products in blue that we have built on that initial scenario requirements block. So we start really kind of getting an understanding of what that environment is going to be. What is the area of operations we're specifically interested in? Going through what we call the intelligence preparation of the battlefield. How deep or how detailed do we need to represent units? What are the mission statements and the commander's intent? What are we doing in this fight? What is the larger concept of operations need to look like? Following that, we begin to actually go through what we call a course of action development and analysis process. Now, that is, you'll see on the left-hand side, those mission analysis products were developed in the previous block. And out of this course of action development and analysis process, we produce these more specific scenario products. So again, now at this time, we're refining the products that we're going to need. We're really focused in on what is both the friendly and the threat doing. What is the composition of both the friendly and the threat? What type of capabilities are they bringing to bear? And let me remind everybody, this is the future. So these capabilities may not exist right now, but we have to have an understanding of what those capabilities could be in the future. So what does something look like 20 years from now? And how are we going to represent that in a scenario? So we go through those various, we come up with multiple courses of action in terms of looking at this particular problem set in a bunch of different ways. Then we go to the top right-hand corner, and that's where we start looking at those various courses of action through, bringing in outside individuals to look at our products and to help us refine what we're trying to do. So we are bringing in what we call warfighter validation. So you're bringing in the various centers of excellence. So you're bringing in people, subject matter experts from across the United States. You're bringing in fires experts from Fort Sill. You're bringing in the infantry experts from Fort Benning. You're bringing in cyber experts from Fort Gordon. You're bringing intelligence people from Fort Huachuca. You're bringing all those people in, and you start going through workshops to to both brief them and then to refine through their help what your courses of actions need to be. And so you begin to update through these workshops those products on the right-hand side in blue. An updated CONOPS, updated enablers, and then you're going to select a certain course of action. And as you can imagine, oops, and we just lost the slide.
My bad.
Oh, but that's okay. I can still talk. So you can imagine that if we're talking about a very complex, slide 8, I believe, Rick.
Yep,
If we're talking about a very complex, what I would call a fight, dealing with large numbers of forces, there are so many different components into there that you really have to have an understanding, because all those components, whether it's fires, what we call maneuver, so maneuver, you can think tanks, Bradleys, ISR assets, intelligence collection assets, all those various things depend on each other. And there is no single expert on all of those systems. You have to bring all the experts in, and you have to work through these various workshops, and collectively we come together. And what happens is, in that second to last box on the right hand side, we conduct a war game, and then we actually come up with results. And so out of that war game, the community has collectively developed a concept of operations, a specific course of action that they are going to go forward with. They are coming up with what we call constraints, limitations, and assumptions. So everyone agrees that these are, these are sort of the, how we are creating this box, for lack of a better word, this operational environment. What does the blue, what we call blue or friendly, what do those operations orders need to look like? What do the threat or red concept of operations need to look like? A more refined operational environment description. And we package all of those things up. Now, those things are, potentially it could be tens, if not hundreds of maps or PowerPoint slides that have graphics on them. They are, again, Word documents that describe the effort, or I should say the ending result of this whole process. And then you can take that document, so we would take that document, we would publish it, and then we would then push it to other people outside of, say, the Army community for possibly review. We would have general officers look at this. And then that document will then be taken by analysts, and they will use that as their base, or their, I would say the base, to begin their particular analysis. Next slide, please.
You can, before you go to the next slide, I was going to ask you, so you kind of left off where the analysts now take this operational scenario, kind of large, kind of, broad analysis. Can you talk a little bit about how they tailor that for measurement space and use it within the study?
Yeah, so a large operational scenario. So like I said on the previous slide, it's what I would call the Joint Forces operational scenario. It's very broad. It does not talk about the details that typically are required of the types of analysis that we do here. So what we have to do is we have to take and I'm trying to think of an example. We would take.
Let me talk for just a minute, Ken, because I think you're talking a little broader than what I wanted to focus you on. So at the end of this approval process, we have a scenario that is talking about, maybe still a core level fight, a huge fight that's going on, and we're going to want to take that scenario and maybe do a study on infantry, fighting vehicles, and tanks. So you're getting down to where you're talking detailed ground maneuver and how they shoot and how they operate with the rest of the force there. So Ken's group, along with works with the analyst team and finds the proper section of that larger scenario and takes a finds a brigade fight within there. And I know brigades and corps maybe don't mean much to you, but a smaller portion of that in a proper chunk of terrain, and say, yeah, now we need something that focuses on, hey, our new tanks maybe can shoot up to 25 kilometers. So we need something that can give us targets at that range. Maybe they got sensors that can see a long way. So we need to make sure there's some terrain that allows you to see that far. Otherwise, you're never going to see the benefit of those systems. And so then we kind of take that chunk and then refine that even further into more detail, exactly where other units are, and what's the ensure you have the right threat forces in that fight, the right not only the right tanks that we're looking at, et cetera, but any other enablers that might be appropriate at that point that we would have to bring in to represent. And that's kind of the product that we develop and do map X's and then hand that off to the scenario integrators. Actually, the scenario integrators would be part of that process. And later, Roger Cordray, I believe, is presenting a briefing on, or one of his guys is presenting a briefing on, how we do scenario integration, how we get that paper description or some kind of digital form of that into a combat model. And Ken, correct anything I said wrong?
Nope, you were correct, Rick. You were correct. Next slide, please, because I know I'm pushing the timeline. So guys, in summary, it's somewhat challenging talking about scenarios without you being able to actually see what one is. To me, because of classification, we're always going to be challenged with that. But I would say that at the end of the day, you need scenarios. All major acquisitions, they have to have a scenario that underpins that. You need that environment to be able to understand or kind of collectively wrap your head around what that future is going to be, because everybody has a different opinion or a different view of what 20 or 30 years may look like. But I would say at the end of the day, scenario development, it's an art and it's a science. It takes information from multiple sources, inputs from multiple people, from multiple SMEs across the Army and the joint community, and you craft that into a product that a study team or analysts can actually use to begin their analysis. Subject to questions.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but feel free to pipe in. No? Okay, then, Ken, thank you so much for your presentation. I know that that was very informative to the students that we have online. We're going to switch now to Mr. Griffith and Mr. Avila. They are going to present combat modeling and architecture overview.